But before I highlight the challenge, why don't I highlight the really success story of Iraq? And it primarily resides in the oil and gas sector, in the oil sector primarily. Because if you look at Iraq, I mean, over the last 40 years, we could see that their oil production was going through cycles like on a roller coaster, up and down, up and down. But actually, over the last 10 years, we can easily say that Iraq is the only big oil producing country that has suffered from lots of wars, civil unrest, you name it, and yet managed not only to recover its production peak, and in the case of Iraq, it was reached in the late 1970s, but also to nearly double its production in less than 10 years. So that is really, really impressive. But I fear this is where the success story ends. However, I mean, if I look at the opportunities for Iraq, and you mentioned in your opening remarks about the lessons that Iraq can learn from other countries, I say that Iraq doesn't need to look elsewhere because they have their own example of success right at their own doorsteps, actually within their own country, and that is the oil sector. Why? Because if you look at Iraq, especially in its neighborhood in the Middle Eastern region, you find that Iraq has a rather colorful corporate landscapes, and they have many international oil companies investing in the oil sector. And it was, in my opinion, the combination, of course, of valuable reserves in the ground and low-cost production, but also international capital, private capital, and private expertise that allowed Iraq to achieve the success story that I highlighted in my opening remarks. And as such, I wonder why Iraq has not replicated this kind of industry structure elsewhere. Because if you look beyond the oil and gas sector, you can find the presence of the private sector very anemic and a very bloated public sector. And this, in my opinion, is not a recipe for success, but a recipe for holding the economy back. You need private investment, you need private capital, to support the developments of different sectors of the economy. I will not pinpoint which sectors need to be developed. You open the sector, the economy, you set up the right institutional framework, and investment will come, and it will be directed in the most efficient sector from the investor's perspective. However, investment, as we all know, is not parachuted. So it doesn't just come because you have oil and gas resources, as we saw, for example, in other countries such as Venezuela. You need certain ingredients, certain pillars in place. And unfortunately, when I look at those pillars in Iraq, I see them missing. And any reforms, economic reforms that aim to achieve sustainable development in the country must tackle those pillars. And here, if you look at the performance of Iraq on institutional or indices related to good governance or fighting corruption or transparency, sadly, you see that Iraq ranks always in the bottom. The same thing on the World Bank's ease of doing business, whatever you think of that indicator. Also, Iraq ranks in the bottom countries, just next to or a little bit ahead or sometimes behind what we call this today as failed states. So in my opinion, the economic reforms that Iraq should target, and I'm not going to say what opportunities are there because Iraq is a very rich country, not just in oil resources and gas resources, but other natural resources, among others, and they have talented people. So by targeting those important pillars, setting up the right institutional framework, reducing the burden of doing business in Iraq, will bring in the international capital, will bring in the private investment to the country, and as such allows the economy to diversify away gradually from oil.